At the end of the 19th century, the world still looked British. On almost every globe, vast regions were washed in the same imperial color, a visual proof of a system so large that its administrators liked to say, the sun never set upon it. From the fog-bound docks of London to the steaming harbors of Hong Kong, from the frozen wilderness of Canada to the sheep stations of Australia, Queen Victoria ruled over a quarter of humanity. The Royal Navy was the steel spine of this planetary empire, a fleet so dominant that no serious rival had dared challenge it since the fall of Napoleon. London was not merely a capital city, it was the clearinghouse of world trade, the heart of global finance, the court of last appeal in international law. To the British ruling class, the bankers, aristocrats, and administrators who managed this colossal machine from quiet clubs and oak-paneled rooms, the world seemed stable, hierarchical, and permanent. It was a world that appeared not only orderly, but destined to remain British forever. Yet across the Atlantic, a different kind of power was slowly taking shape. For most of the 19th century, Europe had looked at the United States with a mixture of condescension and mild unease. The Americans were seen as loud, provincial cousins, obsessed with their own internal expansion. A nation that had spent decades tearing itself apart in civil war, and then finishing the conquest of its own continent by force. But by the 1890s, that phase of history was over. The frontier was closed. There was no more land to take, no more internal worlds to conquer, and the immense energy that had driven generations of pioneers westward now had nowhere to go. While Britain had been busy policing its distant possessions, America had been building something else entirely. Its factories multiplied, its cities swelled, and its production of steel surpassed that of Britain itself. Its railway network stretched like a web of iron across the continent, larger than that of the rest of the world combined. Millions of immigrants poured into its ports, hungry for work, wages, and a place in a new society. In a single generation, the United States had become an industrial giant without an empire. But this transformation came with instability. The American economy lurched violently between booms and busts, and the Great Depression of 1893 had left deep scars. Banks collapsed, unemployment soared, strikes shook the cities, and a sense of frustration and humiliation settled over the country. Beneath the social unrest, a new emotion was growing, something more dangerous than anger. It was ambition. A feeling that America had grown up, that it deserved to be taken seriously, that it was no longer willing to remain a second-rank power in a world still formally dominated by old European empires. Two immense historical forces were now moving toward each other. On one side stood the British Empire, still vast, still powerful, but stretched thin across every ocean and every continent, an empire whose strength was also its weakness. On the other side stood the American Republic, young, dynamic, industrial, and restless, a nation with enormous potential and no clear direction in which to release it. The collision between these two trajectories did not occur in the great strategic choke points of the world. Not in Egypt, not in India, not in the trade routes of Asia. It began instead in a forgotten, steaming corner of South America, a place that most people in London and Washington could not have found on a map. Between Venezuela and the British colony of Guiana lay a vast stretch of jungle, a suffocating world of swamps, rivers, insects, and dense forests, long regarded as economically useless and politically irrelevant. For decades, no one had cared where the exact border ran. But empires have always hated blank spaces on maps. In the 1840s, Britain sent a German surveyor named Robert Schomburg to chart the region. When he returned, he had drawn a line that pushed British claims far to the west, deep into territory that Venezuela considered its own. Britain accepted the line. Venezuela protested. Britain ignored the protest. The small South American republic was weak, politically unstable, and chronically divided by coups and civil wars. Britain was the most powerful empire on earth. For more than 50 years, the dispute lingered as a minor diplomatic irritation, a technical argument over a wilderness that seemed to offer nothing of value to anyone. Then history, as it so often does, changed the meaning of geography. In the late 19th century, prospectors discovered massive gold deposits in the heart of the disputed territory. What had once been dismissed as worthless jungle suddenly became a prize of enormous value. The largest gold nuggets ever found were pulled from that mud, and almost overnight, a gold rush began. Miners, traders, and settlers flooded into the region, most of them from British Guiana. The British government, sensing both profit and strategic advantage, moved quickly. It formalized its claim to the Schomburg Line, and then went even further, extending its demands deeper into the interior. What had once been an abstract border question became a matter of power, money, and survival. For Venezuela, the new British claims were nothing less than a national emergency. They did not merely threaten to take pieces of jungle, they reached toward the Orinoco River Delta, the main artery of Venezuelan trade and the gateway to its economy. If Britain controlled that river, it could effectively place the entire country in a desperate and isolated. The Venezuelan government broke diplomatic relations with London and appealed to the great powers of Europe for support. No one answered. No one wanted to challenge the British Empire over a distant patch of jungle. At that moment, Venezuela understood that it had only one card left to play. If it wanted to survive, it would have to pull a new and unpredictable power into the dispute. It would have to turn to the United States. Venezuela's last gamble was to turn a forgotten border dispute into a test of American destiny. In Washington, the Venezuelan government found the perfect instrument in a former American diplomat named William Scruggs, a man who understood that in the United States, politics was moved not only by facts, but by stories. Scruggs did not argue like a cautious lawyer. He argued like a propagandist. He wrote a pamphlet with a title designed to inflame emotions rather than invite discussion. British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine on Trial. He sent it to every congressman, every senator, and every major newspaper editor in the capital. His argument was simple, direct, and explosive. If Britain could expand its empire in South America, then the Monroe Doctrine was meaningless. The doctrine proclaimed in 1823 by President James Monroe had declared that the American continents were no longer open to European colonization and that any attempt by European powers to extend their political system into the Western Hemisphere would be considered a threat to the peace and safety of the United States. For more than 70 years, this declaration had lived in a strange limbo, more symbol than strategy, more principle than policy. The United States had rarely possessed the naval or military strength to enforce it against the great empires of Europe. But the country that Scruggs was addressing in the mid-1890s was no longer the fragile republic of Monroe's time. It was an industrial giant, wounded by economic crisis, restless and increasingly conscious of its own power. The Depression of 1893 had shaken American society to its core. Factories closed, banks failed, unemployment soared, and violent strikes broke out in the great cities. President Grover Cleveland, a conservative Democrat known for his personal integrity, found himself politically His opponents accused him of weakness, of lacking vision, of allowing the nation to drift, while ordinary people suffered. In this atmosphere, Scruggs's pamphlet fell like a spark into dry grass. It offered not only an external enemy, but a moral crusade. It transformed a distant jungle dispute into a question of national honor. Cleveland's Secretary of State, Richard Olney, was particularly receptive to this argument. Olney was a former corporate lawyer with a combative temperament and an unshakable belief in American acceptance. When he looked at a map of South America, he did not see a minor colonial quarrel. He saw a test of authority. If Britain could simply redraw the map of Venezuela whenever it discovered gold, then the United States was not truly sovereign in its own hemisphere. In Olney's mind, the Monroe Doctrine was not a polite suggestion. It was a declaration of supremacy, even if no previous administration had dared to say so openly. In the summer of 1895, Olney sat down in the State Department and drafted a diplomatic note to the British government that would become one of the most aggressive documents in the history of American foreign policy. It was not written in the language of compromise. It was written like a legal indictment. Olney did not merely ask Britain to submit the border dispute to arbitration. He lectured them on the nature of power in the Western Hemisphere. He wrote that the United States was practically sovereign on this continent, and that its will was law in matters that concerned its interests. It was a breathtaking claim. In a few sentences, the American government was announcing that the age of European supremacy in the Americas was over. The note was sent to London in July 1895. It landed on the desk of Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, an old aristocrat who embodied the confidence and the fatigue of the Victorian ruling class. Salisbury read Olney's words with a mixture of irritation and amusement. From his point of view, the argument was legally absurd. The Monroe Doctrine, he correctly noted, was not part of international law. It was simply a unilateral statement made by one American president decades earlier. Europe had never recognized it, and Britain certainly had no intention of allowing Washington to dictate its colonial boundaries. Convinced that the Americans were merely posturing for domestic political reasons, Salisbury made a decision that would almost change the course of history. He did nothing. He set the note aside. He went on vacation. He focused his attention on far more familiar and, in his eyes, far more important problems in Africa and the Near East. In London, the Venezuela question seemed trivial, hardly worth the effort of a formal response. In Washington, however, the silence was interpreted very differently. Weeks passed, then months. To Cleveland Olney, The absence of a reply felt like a calculated insult. It was the British aristocracy, they believed, looking down on the American Republic as an upstart that did not deserve a serious answer. Finally, in late November 1895, the British response arrived. It came in the form of 2 carefully written notes. Their tone was polite, almost academic, but their message was unyielding. Salisbury dismantled Olney's arguments point by point. He explained that the Monroe Doctrine did not apply to a boundary dispute between a European colony and an American state. He rejected arbitration. He refused to retreat from the Schomburg Line by a single inch. In essence, he was telling the United States to mind its own business. When President Cleveland read the reply, he was furious. To him, it was not merely a diplomatic disagreement, it was a public humiliation. Britain had not only said no, it had treated the United States like a child who needed to be educated in the realities of the world. In that moment, Cleveland decided that the issue could no longer remain confined to the quiet corridors of diplomacy. If Britain would not listen in private, then it would be confronted in public. The crisis was about to leave the realm of letters and enter the dangerous world of national pride, popular opinion, and irreversible decisions. When the news of Cleveland's escalation reached London, it landed like a thunderclap in a clear sky. For most people in Britain, Venezuela had been little more than a word in the foreign pages of newspapers, a distant and irrelevant corner of the world. Now, almost overnight, they were being told that the President of the United States was prepared to risk war with the British Empire over a jungle most of them could not have found on a map. The initial reaction was disbelief. Many assumed it was a theatrical gesture for American domestic politics, a kind of exaggerated bravado that would fade as quickly as it had appeared. But as the reports from the British ambassador in Washington accumulated, a more disturbing picture emerged. This was not a performance. The American government was deadly serious, and the mood of the American public was turning rapidly and dangerously hostile. Lord Salisbury summoned his cabinet, and for the first time the crisis was examined not as a legal quarrel, but as a strategic nightmare. The admirals were asked to evaluate what a war with the United States would actually mean. On paper, the Royal Navy was still the largest fleet in the world, the pride and shield of the empire. But when its ships were plotted on a map, the reality became uncomfortable. They were scattered across every ocean, guarding trade routes from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, from Africa to East Asia. To fight the Americans, Britain would have to concentrate its fleet in the Atlantic, and doing so would leave the rest of the empire dangerously exposed. India, the jewel of the crown, would be vulnerable. So would the routes through Suez and around the Cape. A single decision in the Western Hemisphere threatened to unravel the entire global system, and even in the Atlantic, the balance was not as reassuring as tradition suggested. The United States possessed an advantage no European power could match. It could not be invaded. Its territory was vast, its population enormous, and its industrial base growing at a frightening pace. The British Army, small and designed for colonial policing rather than continental war, could never hope to conquer or occupy such a country. Canada, meanwhile, the crown jewel of Britain's North American possessions, was an almost impossible liability. It shared a border with the United States that stretched for thousands of miles, a border that was effectively undefended. If war came, American troops would cross it in multiple places at once, and cities like Montreal and Toronto would be in their hands long before any serious British reinforcements could arrive. The Royal Navy might rule the seas, but it could not hold a continent. As the planners went deeper, the picture grew even darker. The Americans were not just numerous, they were productive. Their factories could build ships, guns, and ammunition faster than British yards could match. A war would not be a short, decisive confrontation. It would be a long, grinding struggle against a nation with almost limitless resources. And then there was the problem that frightened the government even more than battleships and armies. Money. In December 8, as rumors of war spread, financial markets reacted with panic. On what became known as Black Friday, stocks fell sharply. British investors, who held enormous quantities of American railway bonds and industrial shares, rushed to sell. The flow of capital that connected London and New York began to seize up. The city of London, the financial heart of the empire, sent an unmistakable message to the government. A war with the United States, Britain's largest trading partner, would not merely be expensive. It could be catastrophic. It could shatter confidence, drain gold reserves, and cripple the very system of global finance on which British power depended. For the first time in generations, the leaders of the empire were forced to confront a terrifying possibility. They might not be strong enough to win. They might not even be strong enough to survive the consequences of trying. And Britain was alone. In Europe, the German Kaiser was growing more aggressive and unpredictable. In southern Africa, tensions with the Boer republics were rising toward open conflict. In Asia, Russia, and Japan, were both expanding their ambitions. Britain had long prided itself on its policy of splendid isolation, on the idea that it did not need permanent allies. Now that isolation looked less like a position of strength and more like a strategic trap. Lord Salisbury, who had dismissed the Monroe Doctrine as an American fantasy only months earlier, now found himself staring into a widening abyss. He could stand his ground, defend imperial pride, and risk a war that might consume the empire's resources and expose its vulnerabilities to every rival on earth. Or he could accept a humiliating retreat and acknowledge, at least privately, that the balance of power was shifting. As Christmas approached, the atmosphere in London grew heavy with unease. Newspapers were filled with speculation about invasion routes and naval battles. Telegraph cables between London and Washington hummed with urgent, coded messages. The British lion was crouched, uncertain whether to leap or withdraw. The American eagle was screaming, carried forward by a wave of popular nationalism that saw Britain not as a cousin, but as a bully that needed to be challenged. For a few weeks, the world stood on the edge of a conflict that could have rewritten the history of the 20th century before it had even begun. Then, as so often happens in history, events on the other side of the world intervened. In early January 1896, news arrived in London of a disaster in South Africa. A British colonial adventurer named Leander Starr Jameson had led an illegal raid into the independent Boer Republic of the Transvaal, hoping to trigger an uprising. The raid collapsed in humiliating failure, and the raiders were captured. The embarrassment was severe, but what followed was even worse. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II sent a telegram to the Boer president congratulating him on repelling the British intruders, without the help of friendly powers. To the British public and political class, this message was an insult and a warning at the same time. It suggested that Germany was willing to challenge British influence not only in Europe but across the empire. Overnight, the emotional focus of the country shifted. The anger that had been building toward Washington suddenly turned toward Berlin. For Salisbury, this was a grim revelation, and, paradoxically, an opportunity. Germany, not America, was the most dangerous long-term rival. Britain could not afford to face both at once. The Venezuelan crisis, which had seemed like a question of honor, now looked like a strategic distraction, and in that realization lay the beginning of the end of the confrontation with the United States. In the first weeks of 1896, the world still seemed to be balanced on a knife edge. The crisis between the United States and Great Britain had not yet been resolved, but something fundamental had already changed. In London, the shock of the Jameson raid and the German Kaiser's provocative telegram had brutally clarified Britain's strategic reality. The greatest threat to the empire was no longer an ambitious republic across the Atlantic. It was a rising, aggressive power in Europe. Germany was building a fleet, expanding its influence, and testing British resolve wherever it could. Britain could not afford a global confrontation on two fronts. The Venezuelan dispute, which only weeks earlier had been framed as a matter of imperial honor, was quietly reclassified as a problem to be contained and neutralized. Lord Salisbury understood that pride was now a luxury the empire could no longer afford. Without public drama and without grand declarations, signals were sent to Washington indicating that Britain was ready to talk. The negotiations that followed were cautious, indirect, and carefully worded, but their direction was unmistakable. Britain was preparing to step back. In February 1896, the decisive announcement was made. The British government agreed to submit the Venezuela border dispute to international arbitration. This was the moment the crisis ended, although it took time for the full meaning of that decision to be understood. For months, British diplomats had insisted that Her Majesty's government would never submit to such a process. Now, it was doing exactly that. Officially, the retreat was disguised with technical conditions and legal language. British representatives argued that any settlers who had lived in the disputed territory for decades should be allowed to remain, regardless of where the final line was drawn. The Americans, eager to claim victory without firing a shot, accepted these conditions. Both sides could now present the outcome as a reasonable compromise. But everyone who mattered knew the truth. Britain had blinked. The Monroe Doctrine had been enforced without a war. The arbitration tribunal that met in Paris in 1899 was almost an end. It consisted of 2 British judges, 2 American judges acting as Venezuela's advocates, and a neutral Russian diplomat. When the final decision was announced, the irony was striking. The tribunal awarded Britain the vast majority of the disputed territory. The famous line drawn decades earlier was largely upheld. The goldfields remained in British hands. On the map, very little seemed to have changed, but in reality, everything had changed. The location of the border was no longer the point. The precedent was, for the first time, the British Empire had formally accepted that it could not act unilaterally in the Western Hemisphere. It had acknowledged, in practice, if not in words, that Washington was now the ultimate authority in the Americas. This quiet surrender marked the beginning of a profound transformation in British grand strategy. The ruling class in London, shaken by how close they had come to a catastrophic war, began to reassess their entire position in the world. They looked at the rapid rise of Germany in Europe, the steady expansion of Russia in Asia, and the overwhelming industrial growth of the United States. The conclusion was unavoidable. The era of effortless British dominance was over. The empire would have to choose its priorities, and above all, it would have to choose its friends. The United States was the one power Britain could not defeat, and therefore must never again seriously confront. This was not a sentimental decision based on language or shared culture. It was a calculation rooted in cold realism. American industry, American capital, and American manpower were becoming the central forces of the global system. Securing American goodwill was the best insurance policy the British Empire could buy, and so began a slow, deliberate process of strategic retreat and accommodation in the Western Hemisphere. The first great concession came in 1901. For half a century, Britain and the United States had been bound by a treaty that required any canal across Central America to be a joint project. When Washington demanded the right to build, own, and fortify the Panama Canal alone, Britain did not resist. In the past, such a demand would have been unthinkable. Control of global trade choke points had always been the essence of British power. This time, London simply agreed. It asked for nothing in return. It handed over the most strategic waterway of the 20th century as a peace offering. Then came the military withdrawal. For generations, British naval squadrons, based in Bermuda, Halifax, and the Caribbean had symbolized imperial authority in the Americas. In the early years of the new century, those squadrons were recalled. The ships were sent back to European waters to face the growing German threat. The bases were hollowed out. The garrisons were reduced. Britain was quietly demilitarizing its frontier with the United States. It was making a calculated bet that it no longer needed to defend Canada or the Caribbean from American power, because American power was now the dominant force in the region. The consequences were immediate. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain and seized Cuba's destiny, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Other European powers grumbled. Britain did not. On the contrary, it supported the Americans and helped prevent European interference. A new partnership was being born. This new relationship was tested again in 1902, when Britain, Germany, and Italy blockaded Venezuela to force the payment of debts. President Theodore Roosevelt watched closely and issued what became known as the Roosevelt Code, declaring that the United States would act as the policeman of the Western Hemisphere. When Roosevelt quietly warned the Europeans to back off, the British did so without argument. Only 7 years earlier, they had been willing to risk war over a jungle border. Now they were publicly welcoming American leadership in the region. The transformation was complete. The long-term consequences of this shift shaped the entire 20th century. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Britain found itself financially exhausted within 2 years. It was American loans and American industry that kept the empire fighting. If the two countries had remained rivals after 1895, history might have taken a very different path. Instead, the crisis over Venezuela became the moment when the torch was passed, not with ceremony, not with treaties, but with a confrontation that one side chose not to pursue to the end. For Venezuela, the outcome was bittersweet. The country had been saved from British expansion, but it had fallen firmly into the American sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, et tournet out, was not designed to protect Latin America from empire. It was designed to ensure that the only empire allowed in the region would be the American one. Today, the jungle border between Guyana and Venezuela is still wild and beautiful. The old mining camps have been swallowed by the forest, but the invisible line that runs through those trees marks one of the great fault lines of history. It is the place where the 19th century ended and the 20th century began. The place where the British lion turned away. The place where the United States learned that it could give orders to the world, and the world would listen. The crisis of 1895 is a reminder that the most important wars are often the ones that are never fought. Britain lost a hemisphere without firing a shot, but in doing so, it secured the alliance that allowed it to survive the storms to come. It was a retreat, and it was a humiliation, but it was also one of the smartest strategic decisions the empire ever made. In the ruthless logic of history, Britain lost a continent, but it kept its existence. And sometimes, survival is the only victory that truly matters.